The Ukrainian Special Forces soldier pointed his weapon at the Russian and demanded his surrender. It was an intense moment. That man's journey to that point had been long. Every step during 4 years of war by so many men had contributed to that soldier being there, facing a rifle toward Pokrovsk. During that time, poorly trained soldiers climbed ranks over mountains of corpses. But elite men were also thrown into the same meat grinder. Some were essential, others were spent as regular infantry in situations that turned years of training into seconds of death. For Russians and Ukrainians, it was the same fatal waste, using their best men to feed the worst part of the war. The beginning of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 involved the use of special forces in its most basic plans. They didn't even have a code name. It was a special operation. Whatever the political motives and peculiarities behind that name, it already fit very well with the special forces. And that was part of the plans. It was no coincidence that Vivolokhin Artyom Mikhailovich, commander of the 790th Special Purpose Detachment of the 3rd Guard Spetsnaz Brigade, made it through the years of war, trying to fulfill his role in the best way possible. He was promoted after others fell and served, facing the challenge of carrying out the same insane orders from his superiors, managing to make a difference with the Elit Spetsnaz Special Forces. He didn't live through Soviet times, but he knew the success stories from Operation Storm 333 in Afghanistan. When the war began, the Special Forces were called in. They were a source of pride for the army. He had training for action. Still in 2022, Vivolokhin Artyom Mikhailovich was deployed along with the 3rd Spetsnaz Brigade to Luhansk. It was hot at the time, right in the middle of summer. The Spetsnaz moved through the Ukrainian forests, passed through the defenses, flanked and killed the enemies before they even realized it. The rifles were aimed sharp at the enemy who was in full retreat. Ammunition was replenished as the squad advanced, killing. Ukrainians fell. Their bodies were left lying in the forest as the special forces marched on. The scouts identified, marked, and killed when necessary. Time doesn't pass by the Yankees. Look, look, look. Premier. These rapid movements between the trenches, often accompanied by artillery slaughter, caught the Ukrainians by surprise inside the defensive positions. Many of them had ducked down to protect themselves from the bombs. Drones weren't even ubiquitous in 2022 as they would be in the following years, when Vivolokhin would see men being hunted by the flying pests. Vivolokhin's Spetsnaz were highly trained soldiers in infiltration tactics. They could move through the Ukrainian forests until they reached hills where they set up their guided missiles. From these positions, Vivolokhin watched his men lock onto the target with the laser sight and let the projectile fly toward the Ukrainian facilities. The radio broadcast information discussing the success of the shots and the need to break through enemy defenses for even more punishment. Radio broadcast shots need more punishment. More punishment, even more. The operator then gathered the material, joined the troops, and retreated. Then, they used strategic positions to mark the Ukrainian defenses. Identifying the coordinates at a time when most drones were still for reconnaissance was important to help with Russian advances and the operation of the artillery. The Ukrainian fields were painted by black smoke and the quick flashes of explosions. The Ukrainian fields were painted with his men as he saw fit. But the strategy started to change. At that time, there was basic structural planning in the Russian forces. The special operation was supposed to be quick and deadly, and many of the battalions were not at full strength. In insane decisions by the high command, the special forces were thrown into the front line. Vivolokhin saw his men suffer as infantry in the attempts to quickly take Kiev. A Ukrainian BTR-4E advanced in an urban environment and encountered Russian troops already deeply infiltrated within the territory. After a brief moment to identify them, the crew opened fire with the 30mm cannon, releasing the souls from the Russian flesh. The shots tore the entire squad apart in a matter of seconds. The Spetsnaz were sent atop armored vehicles, taking part in mechanized assaults that were destroyed in Ukrainian ambushes. It was a time when Russia still had the upper hand in the war, but the recklessness of commanders sent their best resources into the worst situations. The paradox was clear. Russia was fighting against weaker, disorganized, and, depending on the region, demotivated armed forces. Since the beginning of the conflicts in 2014, even so, they allowed themselves to get caught in enemy ambushes. The Great Bear tried to advance across the plain, believing that its size would give it security, but it only made the job easier for Kiev's Special Forces troops. Like the 140th Special Purpose Regiment facing a slow and confident enemy. At that moment, Ukraine used its special forces as they should be used, with the government punishing the Russians in their arrogant advance. Long live the crazy one being watched. These ones embody the army, a type of weaponry like a kind of war armament. Russia, making Russia, couldn't achieve a great one. And in Russia, which in 2022 was the largest Russian Republic, which instead of being one became part of Russia. Considering only names identified on social networks and not including the seriously injured or those whose families did not publish their deaths. 56 may seem like a low number for a brigade estimated between 1,500 and 2,000 men. Even so, they represented about 2.8% to 3.7% of the total force. Losing that number of individuals from an elite force just in confirmed deaths over a short period was an extremely high attrition rate. In high-intensity conflicts like in Ukraine, confirmed deaths are only the tip of the iceberg. For every soldier killed, there are many more wounded. The historical and doctrinal ratio usually varies between 1 killed for every 3 or 4 wounded, which puts total casualties between 224 and 280. This meant almost 14% of the entire brigade. This scenario did not result from individual incompetence or structural weakness, but from mistakes and stupidity in the chain of command. Vivolokhin understood this statistic well, even more so when analyzed in depth. Most of the logistics, communications, rear intelligence, and command personnel suffer much less attrition. Thus, almost all of those 56 deaths and the hundreds of wounded occurred among the operators of the special purpose detachments. The real tip of the spear: if the brigade had about 1,000 to 1,200 effective fighters on the front line, 280 casualties represented the loss of approximately 23% to 28% of its combat strength. The worst part was that the war was still going to intensify. Russian special forces were still operating in various parts of the front. Vivolokhin was transferred to the Kherson and Zaporizhia axis after the disaster that occurred at the end of 2022. At that time, the special forces weren't even talked about that much. The spotlight was on the Wagner Group and its penal battalions, sent in waves of men trained for 1 to 3 weeks against the Ukrainian troops defending Bakhmut. It was the Ukrainians' turn to make absurd mistakes in their determination to defend the city from the Russian mercenaries. To avoid the collapse of conventional defensive lines, often made up of exhausted conscripts from severely depleted mechanized brigades, Ukraine's high-level operational commanders made the controversial decision to deploy their Special Operations Forces, notably the 3rd and 8th SSO regiments and the SBU's Alpha Group, to the primary contact line. It partly worked, but for some reason, the use of highly trained troops as assault infantry or shock defense force was a blatant violation of the Special Forces military doctrine, both Russian and Western. In 2023, an anonymous Ukrainian Special Forces officer even expressed his frustration, complaining that his unit was destined to fight as regular infantry in static battles of attrition. This ground down the Ukrainian Special Forces and even affected their strategies in the counter-offensive battles later that same year. Did the Ukrainian counter-offensive in 2023 have small successes with territories taken, a few, but at what cost? And in what proportion, considering the casualties and the equipment lost? Vivolokhin saw his men hold out properly in these defenses for some time. That didn't mean the fighting was easy. They were human beings fighting in one of the worst wars in the world, at a time when drones already dominated the skies. He saw many friends die that year. He sent his subordinates to carry out higher orders that often ended in their deaths. When the Ukrainians were exhausted, the 3rd Spetsnaz Brigade was deployed to assist in Avdiivka by 2024. That was also a time when Russian special forces had their role before suffering the same degradation. Their commanders had made many mistakes at the beginning of the war, turning them into shock troops, which resulted in significant casualties. But there were still some of these groups taking Ukrainian cities. They moved among the ruins of Vodyany near Avdiivka, engaging the enemy. The artillery helped, and the RPGs and grenades they carried were essential in the shootouts. They needed to blow up the structures where the enemies were hiding. They threw grenades over fallen walls and chased the opponents in combat. The help of drones became a key factor in maintaining a fast and successful assault, reducing the number of casualties compared to attacks without this support. The chance of being wounded was high, but the combined attacks cornered the Ukrainians. The soldiers carried their comrades between the houses, trying to find new cover, but it was no use. The Russians were getting closer and closer, blowing up everything. But the rapid advance of the Special Forces soldiers was disastrous in many instances. After Avdiivka fell, Vivolokhin was deployed in increasingly dangerous assaults or on flanking missions. The explosions came from the shells, forcing proud and men hardened by training to crawl for their lives until they were finally spared from humiliation by the arrival of death. Ukrainian Special Forces were also being used at that time. They entered Russian positions with the basic mission of surrounding the enemy or riddling them with bullets. The gunfire in the shelters started turning defenders into corpses. The blood of their comrades on the ground, combined with the explosion of ammunition, made 3 soldiers surrender. They had new, clean weapons. Those who didn't resist were still able to survive and would be used for prisoner exchanges. Others ended up as corpses. The coagulated blood had already dripped down to the floor. They were even well equipped. The corpses, covered by red patches where death had visited them, were reloaded. They were searched by the Ukrainians to obtain identification. The survivors were interrogated and revealed that they belonged to the 9th Motorized Battalion and were from Russian regions such as Omsk and Tyumen. The advance towards Pokrovsk was becoming increasingly violent. Vivolokhin saw more of his friends fall throughout the whole process. He saw advances, heard stories, but also received more and more news of death. The Russians had to walk longer and longer distances to infiltrate the Ukrainian ranks, being chased by drones the whole time. It was a terrible hunt. All transports were detected early. Roads started to become hunting grounds for drones, first 10 kilometers from the front line, then 20, then 30. Men fed the drones' thirst for death, but the machines were insatiable. Even if Vivolokhin wasn't sent to the front line as one of the little wanderers Moscow used as scouts, his mission was still too risky. Part of the Special Forces remained quite active. Vivolokhin was with his men in hell, and they needed to adapt to survive their leader's orders, even with a brigade worn down by attrition and absurd commands. Now, many of his operators were less experienced, and some of the older, more hardened ones were mutilated at home or scattered in pieces across Ukraine. Often a high-ranking Russian commander was more dangerous than a Ukrainian. Because of this, the Spetsnaz demonstrated ingenuity to survive, although their actions were widely criticized as war crimes, as in the following case. In Tarasivka, they advanced after receiving drone information that a group of scouts was hiding at the entrance of a building. They had to advance with caution, knowing that Ukrainian kamikaze drones were constantly looking for targets. The group heard the buzzing and found B. There they waited in silence until an explosion filled the basement with smoke. Keeping calm, they chose one of the men to carry an explosive charge into the building where the Ukrainians were. The soldier threw the explosive and retreated as the detonation saturated the area. Then the others advanced. Kamikaze drones followed their path, but they responded with rifle fire. They reached the building while the smoke was still spreading. The first one went inside, facing the toxic air. The others followed him, alert to the danger around them. It didn't take long for a kamikaze drone to explode nearby. Still, they maintained discipline, moving forward cautiously. They were ready for the final conflict as they entered the smoke-filled interior. Moving in that environment was suffocating. There were explosions, reduced visibility, and uncertainty about the fate of their own comrades. Inside the structure, with rifles aimed and breathing heavily from the dust in the air, they shouted and fired. They bluffed, claiming that the building was surrounded and that they had more heavy weaponry. The tension grew as both sides waited. In the end, the Ukrainians surrendered, falling for the ploy. Only later, wounded and demoralized, did they realize that they were still numerically superior. Next, the Russians used the prisoners' radio to request support from a nearby Ukrainian tank, pretending to ask for evacuation. The armored vehicle approached quickly. At that moment, the Russians had already coordinated with their drone operators to prepare the attack. The kamikaze drones hit an armored vehicle. The crew, unaware that it was a trap, tried to carry out the rescue mission. The smoke that started coming out of the tank marked the end of the attempt. The occupants hurriedly abandoned the vehicle. No one ran off or separated from the group. Only two managed to regroup, fleeing between the buildings, aware that the drones would soon pursue them. The Special Forces operators did not stop at this success. They used Ukrainian uniforms to move within Tarasivka and establish themselves in forward positions. Thus, they completed the mission without casualties. As long as special forces were still available, this type of attack was possible. Ukrainian special forces fought against these groups of infiltrators. They found them in the tree lines, moving concealed among the trees. In the middle of the advance, the handlers discussed where to set up the ambushes. They used information from drones and coordination from command to find the routes the Russians were using. Sometimes they would find one of those men on foot slowly coming along the edge of the line. He would take the easiest route on foot, and also so the drones could spot him. All they had to do was wait to point their weapon at a surprised man. The initial exchange of words made it seem like everything would end well. But the Russian's final decision was to try to raise his rifle, which resulted in his body being hit with hot lead. The extra weight of the lead threw him to the ground, bleeding. Later, his companions were found and were wiser to surrender. Vivolokhin saw more men die in 2026 once they were already inside Pokrovsk. But being there only made everything worse. They were sent to infiltrate an area covered by drones. The FPVs were after them. There wasn't much they could do. No training at that time could properly protect a man from a fiber optic FPV, immune to electronic interference until it found its target. The living flesh turned into rotten remains in the summer or frozen ones in the winter. Vehicles became expensive bonfires in the bitter cold. Vivolokhin became a corpse. Another Russian mourned along the way. He was another man who couldn't survive the war. Years of training reduced to a corpse in the Ukrainian winter. But at that point, the Russians still had many men with 1 or 2 weeks of training to send against the cities. So the carnage would continue. After all, in a way it was working. Small villages were continuously being captured. The trail of corpses led to more and more Ukrainian territory being taken and Russian flags being raised.